Gabriela here, and welcome back to the Decolonial Dialogues podcast. In today's episode, we're getting some insights on how climate change is fundamentally a labor and class issue. Our guest is Chadli Sadorra, who has been a labor organizer in the Philippines for the past 8 years and also campaigning on the Asian People's Movement on DAP development. In this episode, you'll learn the significant challenges that labor unions in the Philippines and other Asian countries have been facing, including the false solutions proposed under the guise of climate action, and the vital need for a systemic shift away from exploitative practices rooted in colonialism. Let's watch.
My current job is I'm employed in the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, APMDD. So it's like a regional movement of different NGOs, social movements, trade unions, people's organizations working on, one is climate justice and energy, and also debt justice and tax justice. So it's like, if I'm not mistaken, it's been 20 years. It's been it's been around for like 20 years, and it has hundreds of member organizations, including my the national organizations that I'm part of here in the Philippines. So the only way that I was referred to this job was because I'm a labor organizer for a national political center for workers called the Bukluran ng Manggagawang Pilipino, or Solidarity of Filipino Workers. It's a socialist labor center here in the Philippines, and for the past, I don't know, like 8 years, I've been one of the organizers and campaigners for that labor group. And I was a full-time organizer for like half of that. Like after my first job, I just went full-time with almost no allowance or salary, and eventually my savings dried up, so I had to look for for a job. And luckily, there was an opening in APMDD, which my organization was an affiliate of. So I've been here for like 3 years, but also concurrently still a labor organizer for BLEP. Currently, my focus has been on equitable and just transition, campaigning on equitable and just transition. And in particular, we've been trying to involve our work on equitable and just transition revolves around more or less two very important, shall we say, areas of work. So the first is more refining our vision and program on equitable and just transition, especially from the context of the global south. Secondly, it's the more we've been trying to work with we've been trying to capacitate a lot of our member organizations, and with a special focus on trade unions and labor organizations, trying to capacitate them on equitable and just transition, getting them to understand the concept, breaking it down, giving them political experience on this, and more concretely on the movement building aspect. We've been trying to build like national alliances now, or national labor alliances in Philippines, and we're targeting Pakistan, India, and Nepal, where we have a lot of members from. But here in the Philippines, we've already started forming like a national just transition alliance to get labor unions to start acting on, or start mobilizing on climate issues, which we believe is a workers' issue as well. There. My focus has been generally on those, on trying to refine our vision and program of what an equitable and just transition is, and on movement building on getting on building alliances on this issue and trying to get the broader labor movement in Asia uh, to collaborate and work with the climate justice, the global climate justice.
Mhm.
So
Amazing.
there.
You mentioned that I really like when you mentioned that it's important to mobilize labor unions because any climate issues because this is a labor issue. Could you develop a little bit more on that?
Yeah. So like I think in the past, and especially in the 70s and 80s, and the Philippines has a very vibrant and had a very vibrant and dynamic left movement and social movements, especially during the dictatorship,
Mm.
the Marcos dictatorship. I don't know if you've heard about it, and I think it's pretty similar to the military dictatorship that Brazil had,
Yeah.
wherein we had like communist insurgency, like insurrectionary trade union movement, trying to conduct general strikes.
Mhm.
Uh, Although I think Lula did it better, but uh, yeah, we had a very vibrant uh, mass movement here, and that tradition is still very strong. But for I think a lot of decades, a lot of our comrades or the movements I'm part of viewed the the climate issue and climate change in general as more of a middle class issue
Mm.
and not really, how should I say it in English, not really an issue of the gut or for workers and urban poor and farmers
Mhm.
and fishers. But I think in the past 2 decades have shown us, especially the Philippines, which we have every year, we have more and more typhoons and super typhoons, and the impacts of climate change have become so pervasive that we can no longer deny that climate change is an issue
Yeah.
for everyone, and not just like middle class environmentalists, but the impacts of it really hit issues of the gut in terms of food security, with the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of crops that get destroyed because of typhoons, or because of the we have very what do you call tawag dito? We have the hot season, which there's rarely any rainfall anymore. There's like our weather goes into extremes, like either super strong typhoons or super dry, super hot weather, which kills crops either way. In terms of actually for in terms of urban poor and informal sector workers and communities, where we don't have decent housing, and which are very vulnerable to floods. I still remember when I was in high school, the typhoon. I don't know what you call it, the international name, but in our country, it's called Typhoon Ondoy, where it rained for like 48 hours straight and flooded most of Metro Manila. And I was in a retreat for school, and we couldn't, which was held in a mountain, and we couldn't get down for 5 days because the roads were impassable because of the flooding and all the trash and all the cars that were brought about that were stuck in the road because of the floods and the rain. And so that
What was the year?
this 2009. I forgot the international name, but there's also one of the most powerful typhoons on record, if not the most powerful, in 2013. Although I didn't experience it directly because it was in another region in the Philippines. It's a Typhoon Haiyan, if you've heard of it,
Mhm.
which was one of the most devastating super typhoons. And a lot of the people who lived in those regions, especially the poor workers and the urban poor sectors, uh, they still don't have their houses yet, the houses that were destroyed during the typhoon, and the government has done such a shitty job on and profited from actually all the developers that tried to build new houses for these people. Thousands of them still don't have like houses, and it's been 12 years, 11 years since that. So aside from that, one thing we've zeroed into also in terms of the impacts of climate change on marginalized people and working people is that so many workers actually in the Philippines we have very weak, or not necessarily weak, but very, yeah, okay, you can say weak labor laws.
Mm-hmm.
So no work, no pay, right? And we don't get compensated for not being able to report to work due to climate change, due to super typhoons. So because the roads are impassable, because your house has been destroyed by a typhoon, you can't go to work the next day. You don't get paid as well. So the I guess the hundreds of thousands or millions of work hours that have been uh, decimated by climate change, that's also a direct impact to workers. And the heat, the terrible heat we're experiencing. Like today, it was like, I think, 42 degrees in few parts of the country. I guess Brazil gets that kind of heat too, but it's terrible heat, and it's taken a toll on a lot of workers, on their productivity, on their health, etc., etc. And so basically, we've come to realize that regardless if you're poor or rich, climate change hits us all. Uh, and I think that's a class aspect of it also, because aside from the fact that it hits us all, and in fact, the most vulnerable peoples are more impacted. They're the ones who are least responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, especially coming from a developing country that's been colonized by like three northern countries: Spain, Japan for a few years, and the United States. Actually, in the United Kingdom for like 2 years or 3 years in the 18th century. And a lot of the reasons that why we're unable to address climate change sufficiently in terms of adaptation, in terms of building resilience, in terms of being able to transition to renewable energy, is because of we don't have the capacity due to the centuries of underdevelopment that our country has experienced, and a lot of other colonies have experienced as a result or as a consequence of colonization of the most industrialized countries who are actually more responsible for the majority of historic and current greenhouse gas emissions, which are causing
Yeah,
climate change.
exactly.
So yeah,
It's completely unfair and unequal, right? The way that not only the climate change it's impacting the global south in general, but the reason, right? What provoked all the climate collapse that we're living today? It's something that wasn't caused by these specific populations, but we know that these groups are the ones that suffer the most. So like it's outrageous, like to hear everything you were mentioning, like the typhoons, the floods, all the housing issues, like 12 years without housing. That's completely unacceptable. And apart
without
from
decent housing.
exactly without like
Yeah.
adequate housing, right? That will be like basic human rights. But like considering all the traps that we know that exist in the current energy transition, I had like this kind of doubt um, to ask you because you mentioned that like your network it's working with that and development, right? With that justice. And there is a lot of I imagine there is a lot of like more pressing demands when it comes to the current energy transition. So first I wanted to know like how the current energy transition that we know that it's led by corporations with the complicity of governments and institutions and financial institutions, but how it has been unfolding in the Philippines and the neighboring region, and how do you see the relationship with what you were mentioning in the other event that we met when it comes to green colonialism? What are the connections between these two issues?
Right. Okay. So yeah, one of
And you can go like all historical. Don't worry. You can go historical and go today. Like, feel free.
yeah.
You wish.
I want to say it in a simple way, but yeah. So like, I don't think there's any country anymore that's a climate change denier, right? Everyone's accepted that there's climate change. Everybody has accepted that there needs to be a transition from a fossil fuel system to a renewable energy and more sustainable system. But the big problem, and I think this is what grounds climate colonialism, like the discussion or the discourse in colonialism, is the fact that that transition is there are so many structural barriers in the developing world to achieve that transition, and these structural barriers are imposed by or have its vestige or are conditioned by the legacies of unequal exchange between North and South, between exploitative relations between the North and South, between metropole and periphery, or all the other jargon that they use to compare the North and South. So I think one of these structural barriers is the fact that we're not even energy as a country, for example, Philippines, and actually most countries in Asia, India or Southeast Asia. That's why the transition is such a dilemma for them, and that's why they're not so keen on like or not so they're so easily manipulated by the propaganda of or villainized by the propaganda of northern countries because they don't want to transition immediately, etc., etc. It's because of in recognition of those, they recognize that there are all these barriers. And going back, sorry, and one of these barriers, sorry, is that uh, we actually don't have 100% energy access yet in our countries. And more than that, we're not energy efficient. For example, in my country, one of the reasons businesses or foreign, what do you call it? Foreign direct investment, yeah, why it's not as high as in other countries. One of the reasons because of high electricity prices in the Philippines, because we're very inefficient about it, and it's been totally privatized also by national, by our what our what's the English word, by our national bourgeoisie or our national capitalists and who at seek who are very rent seeking in their character rather than like developing industries that will uh, increase or the incomes and develop the Philippines. They focus on these very rent seeking sectors like real estate, privatizing social services like water, like and one big area is energy.
Yeah.
And so that's the dilemma for us actually, because the transition to uh, renewables and more sustainable energy systems. And I'm just talking about energy here because when we talk about equitable and just transition, we mean more than energy, right? We mean like almost every aspect of our economy and society has to change in order to in other words, we transition away from capitalism into something different. But just focusing on energy here, and because of those structural barriers uh, and uh, and encumbrances, like for example, the Philippines actually is one of the countries that had one of the one of the earliest legislated renewable energy laws, which incentivized the private sector and at least on paper the government to develop renewable energy. But a lot of it has been or the growth of that sector, although it is growing, one reason why it hasn't been displacing like the fossil fuel sector is precisely because of these barriers we're addressing, that we don't like we don't have the access to technologies that whose patents are mostly from the global north, and because they own it, we can't just like copy it and make it, even if their technology is for the people. It's the same for renewable energy. You really need a lot of capital investment in order to produce our own panels, produce our own turbines, etc.,
Mhm.
to be able to manufacture it. So it's because of these difficulties and barriers that I think a lot of our developers, or a lot of the sectors or classes that could have the capacity to bring technology in and accelerate the renewable energy transition have been uh or I would say pressured, or to look into false solutions and to other fossil fuel alternatives that have been sanitized but are actually no different from coal, gas, oil, that don't really limit greenhouse gas emissions. So one example is, I think I mentioned this in London in the panel. Uh, we're actually ramping up our investments in gas in the region. So in Indonesia, we're ramping up the investments in the region. In the Philippines, which we don't have a lot of gas reserves. So we're importing it actually. We're importing it, which is a lot more expensive, and it will increase uh, fuel prices and electricity prices. The gas is being labeled as a transition fuel, and it's a transition fuel to renew to supposedly from fossil fuels, but it is a fossil fuels. But yeah, they're using it precisely, this language, this transition fuel, to sanitize it. But it also expresses the contradiction or the barriers we have, that these are choices because we need our energy, right? Our industries are just growing. People don't even have enough energy, and we don't have perfect energy access. So the fact that we're forced to choose these options, I'm not saying it's justified, but I'm saying as a fact that we're these options of like choosing false solutions or doing everything we can to transition to renewables is hampered by that the fact of our underdevelopment imposed by colonial structures, unfair trade agreements, the intellectual property rights imposed by the World Trade Order, etc., etc., and the fact that we don't have that a lot of capital as well to address that. Another example, and this is actually the point that I wanted to, or the story or the case that I wanted to share in London. In the Philippines, we have our transport sector is very what's the word? I won't try to look further. It's very outdated because one of our main modes of transportation is called it's called a jeepney. So we have these old jeeps that they're actually old American Army jeeps from World War II that they left here. Yeah, and we like Filipino ingenuity made it into like a mode of transport.
Oh,
Yeah, so that's a number. Yeah, so I just wrote it earlier today, and it's like majority Filipinos use this as a mode of transport. But yeah, again, it's very old. It uses very outdated engines, which and it emits a lot. It has a lot of emissions as well. But it's considered a traditional mode of transport. We call them like public utility vehicles. They're privately owned and operated by small operators and drivers. It's because we don't have a mass public transport system other than like a few trains and a few metros, but not sufficient enough because the government has shied away from its responsibility to provide cheap mass public transport
yeah.
for the people. So they as that work.
Like jeeps that were donated.
after the World War II, and they were basically like stylish
Yeah.
or something, and they
So
remain the
noted.
same until today.
Yeah, but they weren't stylish when they left it. You know those you've seen like World War II movies, like those like those four-seater Jeeps that the Americans use. So we just repurposed it with a new frame so that more people could enter at the back. So
Mhm.
it's like it can fit like 18 people there. 18 depends on how long it is. But usually like 18 to 20 people.
Oh my God.
10 people per site. So yeah, so we just repurposed these old American Jeeps basically, and it's become like a symbol of our ingenuity, right? And uh, so, but one argument against it is one, it's run by a very old, a very unfair system, which incentivizes drivers to what do you call this? Drivers to break traffic laws or behave badly while driving because the system is the more passengers you have, the higher pay you have. It's not like they don't have like a regular wage. Like they just need to follow the schedule. Unlike like in other countries, no, it's not like that. It's more like the more passengers you have, the more money you have. So yeah, one, it's run in a very old fashioned manner. Two, it's a burden. It's bad for the environment. It's one of the arguments the government has made against it is because we're transitioning to a more sustainable transports. We want to transition to a more sustainable transport system, right?
Mhm.
So what's happening now is that the government implemented a modernization program. It's called the Public Utility Vehicle Modernization Program. So it's like a transition they're conducting, and they're actually using the language of just transition. So they want to transform the jeepneys into more uh, modern looking jeeps that run on like cleaner engines, still using fossil fuels, of course, but some of them electric vehicles. But it's supposedly cleaner. But what's happening is that they're basically forcing the operators, the small operators, and the drivers to pay for that transition. So I won't explain the economics of it anymore. But the burden of buying uh, uh, these new models for the sake of modernity, for the sake of a greener and more sustainable transport system, falls almost solely on the small drivers and operators who barely make enough in a day, right? So some jeepney drivers and operators get indebted like 2 million pesos or 3 million pesos, and they have to pay that in the course of like a few years, but their wages, they really can't do it. So I don't know if you've heard about it, but we had like three national transport strikes last year, one this year. No. Yeah, last year, like three big ones where tens of thousands of jeepney operators and drivers really went to the streets and conducted strikes.
So
Although
why this burden was being left on the drivers themselves? Shouldn't it go to the companies? Like, because it's private owned, right?
no, that's the thing. What they want to do, because it's privately owned, but not by companies, but by small operators and small. So it's basically they're like shopkeepers, right? They have their own jeep, and they have like drivers who get paid a certain portion of the daily income of it.
Mhm.
So what the government wants, rather than nationalizing that system, is to force these small operators to sell their jeeps, basically to run them out of business so that the big players come in and modernize it. So they're gonna privatize or corporatize the jeepney system, the transport system, for the sake of for the sake of climate justice. I have heard one of the secretaries or the secretary or one of the government officials say that climate justice, but leaving hundreds of thousands of drivers indebted, and unemployed.
Oh my God.
And it's in the name of it's a name in the name of the climate, and it's actually a corporate takeover of this flawed. It's true. It's flawed transport system. So this is the kind of transition that we don't want, right? It's corporate led, right? It's unfair, and it leaves a lot of drivers behind.
I
And
see.
connecting it to and the fact that one of the reasons why the government does not want to nationalize. Of course, I'm saying that I'm not saying that like we have a progressive government. We have a very uh very what do you call it? Our political class is very corrupt and short-sighted. But one of the barriers to them nationalizing it is because we don't have the resources to actually it's so difficult. We have to buy the technologies, for example, from of these electric vehicles and new engines from Japan, from actually Indonesia has been producing their own cars, and they have a plan to get into the supply chain of the renewable energy of the extraction and the manufacturing of renewable energy technologies, refining of critical minerals, etc. Our government doesn't have a plan. They're just passing it on to the private sector, and it's leading to a very unjust transition. So because of the strikes last year, there were like a few. What happened was we were able to delay. So there's a small victory in that. We were able to delay the. I won't get technical about it, but we were able to delay the process of to the middle of this year, when it was supposed to be the deadline of drivers having to. I won't get technical; it might confuse you. But the deadline of one part of the process to transition was supposed to be on December, but because of the strikes and the active refusal of the drivers and the operators and their collective action, we were able to delay it. And now there's like court cases filed, etc., etc. So yeah, so that I think that's one big example. We're being forced into tough choices. We're being forced into into false or unjust transitions, partly because partly because of the legacies of our underdevelopment brought about by uh, uh, colonialism and globalization in
Yeah,
our countries. And
exactly.
I haven't even talked about the expansion of the mining and critical minerals that are occurring not just in my country but in Indonesia, in India, to aid the scaling up of renewable energy production and technologies in our
Yeah.
countries.
I really like the way that you were like approaching like the issue around that. I think that this is something that people get a bit confused, I would say, and don't understand exactly how that justice would unfold, right? So when it comes to like dependency that you were mentioning, a lot of things that the Philippines need to import from neighboring countries, but also when it comes to foreign debt, I was wondering if you would like to like elaborate a little bit more on how that justice would look like in this imaginable slash wanted equitable and just transition. What would this look like? And especially when it comes to debt justice, with the whole context that you just shared with me.
Okay, sure. Just a caveat. I'm not actually a debt campaigner, so I'm not an expert on like I know it generally, but I'm not
No
one of
worries.
the campaigners
Just
working
in
on that.
general, it will be good.
Yeah, but yeah, like I think the just transition, when we talk about the equitable and just transition and how we're gonna do an equitable and just transition in the South, that is one of the major barriers to us achieving it. The exorbitant or the enormous amounts of debt that we have to bilaterally to different countries, but also to the international financial institution, the IMF, the World Bank, that prey on our on our backwardness, right? Or our developing economies. So in the just we also work on uh, uh, APMDD. Actually, we're intervening, or we're together with, I don't know if you know, the global campaign to demand climate justice, DCJ.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the international. Yeah, we're one of the founders of that, and we're actually intervening in the Just Transition Work Program in the UNFCCC spaces, in the COP, in the Bonn Intersessional, because in the last COP we were able, there there was in COP 27 in Egypt, they were able to establish a Just Transition Work Program where countries can talk about issues of just transition. And one of the things DCJ is working on is bringing a lot of the these barriers or discussion of these issues, like debt, like tax justice, like trade, into the UNFCCC space, asserting that, hey, you just want to talk about energy, right? These northern governments just want to talk about energy transition. We can't do this energy transition because we're billions of dollars in debt to your countries or to the IMF, to the WTO. So one of the major calls, I think, for an equitable and just transition, and we actually had a conference last August, August 2023 in Bangkok, where it was the Asian Equitable and Just Transition Conference, where we tried to come up with a or collectively come up with a common framework and common set of demands on just equitable and just transition. And one of the major things that popped up is really debt, the discussion of debt, which essentially prevents our governments because they have to pay, or they have to allocate a big chunk of the national budget to debt repayments, right? The debt service repayments. We cannot pay for public services. We cannot pay for public investments into transitioning to renewable energy. So it's another crutch or another big barrier for us to be able to incentivize, use state resources or public resources to plan for and implement a transition.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the jeepney modernization program. We could have we could have subsidized the drivers, right? You could have subsidized the operators for like 10 years, 20 years, help them with the transition. But one of the reasons why we don't the government doesn't do that, one is because they're very capitalist, and they really I don't know what's the perfect word, or they don't want to shoulder the responsibility for a transition of its people. They want the private sector or corporations to shoulder that. Two, it's because we don't have the resources for it. We actually don't have sufficient coffers and capacity and expertise to make that transition. So one major demand that we were able to agree on is to cancel. It's like a global call to cancel the debt, which is actually the major call of the debt campaigners. We
Yeah.
don't we don't we consider a lot of the debts from the IMF and the World Bank as illegitimate debts because they're predatory lending, and actually destroyed our our laws because of and economies because of the structural adjustment programs that they put as a condition to being able to get the debt during times of crisis.
Exactly.
So that's one major call, I think, that we need to be able to which is actually, for if you're a climate justice campaigner, this is something, this is something new, actually, or not that or not that or at least we're not that conscious about it, like the intersection between debt and all these other economic issues with the energy transition, and they're actually connected. We can't we're constricted from being able to transition because one thing is that the debt. Another big thing that we're studying now is trade, especially the trips. The forgot what it's called, but the the protections on intellectual property rights that corporations have, like through patents. Yeah. So we're I think in if we're gonna be able to transition, we're gonna have to produce our own technologies too, right? Because it will generate more incomes, keep money here, keep money in our own country, to circulate it around our own country, and be able to use that money for investing in education, investing in transportation, investing in better industries, investing in housing, etc., etc. But we can't do that. We can't manufacture our own because of like these internationally imposed intellectual property rights that profit from the basic technologies that people need to survive. And renewable energy is a technology that people need. I think it's almost like water,
Yeah.
which actually has been privatized, right? Or air, almost like that. Energy needs to be a public good, and that public good is not like the private sector cannot have exclusive rights to.
Exactly. They cannot dominate this as well, right? Apart from all the other sectors they are already involved.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
So
super concerning, super worrying.
there's that, there's trade. So we're actually connecting because of this issue, the equitable and just transition issue. We're actually able, because of the framing of this issue, right? That we're transitioning. We're talking about what we need in order to transition to a cleaner and more sustainable economy and society, right? And what we're figuring out, what most people are figuring out right now, is that wait, if we're gonna talk about all this stuff that's preventing us from transitioning, we're gonna have to talk about the whole system in general, right? And it's intersections, like the whole capitalist system in general. So the discussion becomes a much broader and more important discussion of system change,
Exactly.
right? Tax is a structural issue. Debt is a structural issue. Trade is a structural issue. They're all systemic, right? And these are stuff that's actually like literally preventing us from being able to do the transition, which the global north is telling us that we need to do. And now we're demanding, okay, in order for us to do this, right? We want a cleaner society, right? We want both north and south. We want a cleaner society. We want a more sustainable society. We want a better climate. But it's in acknowledging what it actually takes to do that. That's the difference between what they want and what we want, what the North actually wants, because they don't want to make it into a systemic issue.
No.
They don't want to make it into the system. They just want it like do it yourself, right?
Exactly.
We're doing
The
it.
system has been ruling in favor of them for
Exactly.
since always. So why would they want these systemic changes as the global south needs and demands, right?
Yeah. So that's why. Yeah, go.
No, sorry, it's super crazy like to hear all of that, because these connections with that, I think it's such a pressing issue. Like we really need to discuss that, because without taking this barrier out, as you said, this is a huge obstacle for the global south to pursue the energy transition. And we can even go broader than that. We can go and talk about ecological transition, because we're not only talking about energy, right? So that was the point that I wanted to ask you, because you said for an equitable and just transition, we're not only looking at carbon emissions. So what are the other aspects of this crisis and of this transition that it's needed, that you and your network and all the alliances that you have in the region are pushing for? What are the other dimensions that we should look when it comes to the transition, apart from the already concerning carbon emissions?
Yeah. So like I said in last August, we were able to at least collectively discuss like principles. Sorry, I think I'm gonna sneeze.
No way.
Right. Yeah, principles and common, like a common framework or common principles and a common set of demands
Mhm.
from Asia on what an equitable and just transition looks like. And actually, here's the thing, which is interesting, which at least I find interesting. When most people talk about equitable and just transition, even labor movements, when they talk about just transition, what they're talking about is the process of what are the components or what are the things needed during the transition, right? Like labor movements to talk about, okay, if we're gonna change technologies, if we're gonna phase out coal, et cetera, we need social protection, we need social dialogue, we need all of these things, right? Which
Mhm.
are really just like safety nets so that people don't get left behind. What's more interesting actually is that the other side of it is we need to have a discussion on what we're transitioning towards, right? And I think a lot of people take that for granted. What we're transitioning to exactly. And
Exactly.
I think a lot of movements are realizing that this is actually a great historical opportunity. Like history is affording us an opportunity to discuss the visions that we've had. I was talking about this, like the social movements at the Philippines, the dynamic movements of the Philippines, the mass movement in the Philippines had since the 70s, 80s, and the visions of the kind of economy, the kind of society we want that they were fighting for then. It's actually so similar to what we want or what we're coming to realize that we want in discussions of equitable and just transition.
Mhm.
Public ownership over the needs of society, right? On housing, on energy, on food, right? On transport, on industry, and the question of where to reinvest surplus in society, right? We should reinvest it. These are things that we are coming to realize are consistent with living sustainably, right? And living in a green way.
Mhm.
Because the what so one way to look at it is like the constant mode of production where growth or capital accumulation, that's actually the logic of that is actually what's destroying the world, right?
Yeah.
So in our conferences we've come to a discussion that, okay, if we want to figure out what we need, what we want to change to, we might as well diagnose the problem altogether, right? What we want to change. It's capitalism. It's really this. It's really it's we think it's at the heart of climate change.
Yeah.
A big reason why there's a climate crisis. It's because of this unending desire for growth and capital accumulation and to build and to burn and to all of these things,
Right.
right?
Keep extracting,
So
extracting, extracting.
yeah, extract yeah. So we need to be able to construct. We started discussing what principles or what visions of the world we should have that must be within the ecological limits of the world. And this is a long discussion, and we we don't really have that much time. But we're still trying to finalize the document that we made, and it's kind of similar to what Assad, the Warren want was trying to do,
Mm-hmm.
because before the festival we had like 3 days of meetings. It's like it was called like the global converge. I don't know if you knew about it. Like the reason why a lot of us were there in the first place was because of these meetings that Warren want convened, like the global convergence and just transition, where we were trying to like find convergences. We were doing that, something similar to that here in Asia, and we've come up with certain principles and parameters. I can send you like a slide deck of what we did. I think that would be more helpful than me explaining it one by one, because it's a lot. But it's not finalized. We're coming up with like an output, like a concrete output to it. Like we're not decided yet if it's going to be a briefer or a document or like a presentation.
Mm-hmm.
But we
How
have
the
like a
content
draft.
will be shared, right?
Yeah, we have like a draft of the presentation, and I can definitely send that to you. And it's basically, I think it's a very excellent document because we talk about like the principles and parameters that we want, like uh But- so for example, we talked about we had breakout groups on manufacturing, on food, on finance, on industry, on transport, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
And they were able to come up with those two things, like what's needed in the transition, and what do we actually want to, what does what does the outcome of the transition look like. And it's not complete, of course, because I think that is a very difficult, like I said, very difficult, like to be able to get like several movements to agree on an exact vision. I think that's very difficult. So it's mostly broad strokes, right? It's not that
Uh-huh.
concrete, or not that, maybe not concrete, but it's not that specific. But I think these are the types of discussions, like the question you asked: what should we transition into, right? What
Mm-hmm.
what should the outcome be of this transit? I think that's the main question that governments, movements, peoples have to ask now. And we're actually afforded an opportunity to ask it now and to translate it into real action. Because if we don't ask that question, climate change is here, right? It's basically accelerating our pushing our movements to ask these questions more concretely and more urgently, because we're gonna die if we don't do it, right? Like our children. I don't know how old you are, but I'm pretty sure. My parents won't live to see like the climate catastrophe that we'll get into in like 20 years, or even 10 years, right? 10 or 20 years. But it's actually our generation, or the younger generation, that's gonna experience all of this. And yeah, I'll stop talking.
No, no, I love it. Thank you so much. I think I have two final questions. One, I wanted to give you a space for sharing a little bit more about how the mining industry is approaching slash expanding its projects in the region, right? You mentioned that there is a lot about critical minerals projects that are expanding, and the last forecast from the World Bank and the International Energy Agency as well, they have some forecasts of an increase of about 450% of mining dependency, mining extraction until 2050, right? And that's to meet the green technology demands. So how mining is its industry it's navigating in the region? What are the main impacts that you were seeing due to the increase and the tendency of larger increase of this industry?
Yeah. So in the Philippines, there's like small scale mining, and then there's large scale mining. There's still actually open pit mines, and yeah, the mining industry has a lot of privileges here. And if I'm not mistaken, because I'm not like directly or immediately focused on that, but we have member organizations that are exclusively anti-mining groups. Or not exclusively, but that's their main advocacy. I can connect you to them. They definitely have more information for here in the Philippines. But I think there is an increase in mining operations in the Philippines, especially big mining like copper, nickel. We are very rich in nickel and copper, and these are actually important minerals for turbines and panels, right? So there's a an increase of that. And what's interesting is we have like national mining companies who are in partnerships with international mining, but they're also competing with, like for example, they're one of the largest firms here is an Australian mining company.
Hmm.
And the national mining companies are actually competing. Some, I'm not saying all, like, or at least a good chunk of it is competing with international mining. So there's this issue of like supporting our national corporations, right? But they're basically it's the same. It doesn't address the problem of mining. It doesn't enforce, like it doesn't lead to a discussion of, or they're not discussing the environmental and social standards that we need to enforce in order to make this mining uh, not, or to prevent this mining from being completely destructive and exponentially grow the extractivism here in the Philippines, and which will doesn't change the supply chain, right? Because we're the we're the provider exporter of the raw mineral, but we have to pay for the final product, like an exorbitant amount of the final product. And actually, other countries like India and Indonesia are making efforts to position themselves into the supply chain of the critical minerals, or the transition. We call it transition minerals supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
Philippines doing a thing where it's like we're doubling down and being like a just an exporter and ending up having to pay a larger bill for buying technologies that could not have been made if it wasn't for us, right? So I could I'd like to be able to tell you more about this, but the mining is less our, because we have, there are so many other movements that were
Yes,
better
yes.
leaning
But
on mining.
the way
We're
that you
partnered with
share,
them.
the way that you share, I can see that there is like a tendency of a new form of dependency as well, right? Unfolding. And considering that the mining industry is being posed as the energy transition leader, right? Do you believe that mining could offer an actual alternative way of the current ecological and climate collapse caused by fossil fuels?
I think there will be. I think the science tells us that we need to scale up renewable energy, right?
Mhm.
If we're gonna defeat this climate crisis. And I don't think we figured out a way to do that without increasing
Extraction,
our
dependent.
extraction of the necessary. So I think there needs to be strong regulation on mining to make it responsible, uh, to make it be within the ecological limits of the earth,
I see.
and to make it be produced for our domestic economies and our peoples. Because right now, what's happening is we're mining for the North. We're mining for their transition, while they're not giving us any leeway on for our transition, right? No
Exactly.
freedom for our transition. So I think Southern governments, they don't realize like the leverage we actually have on the whole supply chain thing. Like this was one of the discussions in London. I don't know if you're in one of the, forgot which panel was it, but actually we actually can have a lot of leverage if Southern governments stick together.
Hmm.
Like if we all decide that to wait to renegotiate the whole supply chain and all the agreements and withhold our minerals, because we could change the balance of it, because it comes from us. They actually have very little. Well, it comes from us in China, because China has like 90% of the refining, right? Most of the refining
The
of
processing of the minerals, everything.
the processing of that is in China. So that's a leverage that they have. But China can. I know a lot of governments and people don't want to hear this, but China is still part of the G77, right? They still identify as part of the world. And I know there's a lot of, especially my country, we have territorial issues from them. Like they actually water bombed one of our boats because they're trying to claim part of the part of our territory, the sea, the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea. But from the perspective of like the whole the whole global economy, uh, I think southern governments can actually have a lot of leverage if if we work together, right? If we have like a unified front of
Mm,
all these southern governments, we actually have a lot of leverage to negotiate or to leverage the fact that we have the minerals
exactly.
and to ensure, yeah. And some countries have been doing it. Like as I said, Indonesia is doing it. India's trying, although India is a whole another discussion on Modi and what they're
Yeah.
doing. But yeah, I think it's actually, and a lot of African countries are actually thinking this way,
Thinking
or
like this.
yeah, and obviously Latin America,
Mhm.
right? Yeah, but I heard Lula just recently made a deal with France for like opening up the Amazon for carbon markets, right? which
It's
which is one thing.
insane.
Yeah,
Every
one thing.
time that we think that, okay, now we're gonna do something, and then another layer of neocolonialism, it's
Yeah,
getting here. Apart from
yeah,
all the like discussion around bioeconomy, like here, it's completely dominated by the industry. It's completely dominated by the industry and agribusiness. So like it's nothing new, it's just a rebranding of the agribusiness that it's now getting a lot of investments, right? As if they were green, but they use a lot of land, they invade traditional territories, they use a lot of water. So a lot of issues like around that. So it is very concerning. But it's a very
I
good
like what
perspective, the way that you share the point around how we could actually leverage the way that we do have the resources, and we should be like changing the terms of this conversation, right?
yeah. I actually like what you said about rebranding, because that's essentially what they're doing with transition, right? They're just rebranding capitalism to something else,
Exactly.
rebranding extractivism to something else, and it's everywhere.
Yes,
Uh,
exactly.
And and with our what's happening with us, like the jeepney, the transport strikes, and the modernization program. That's another kind of rebranding, right? In the name of a like cleaner, greener economy, but
Yes,
nothing's actually changing,
exactly.
which
So
actually won't solve the thing. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, go.
no, but you're completely right. That won't solve the thing. Like it's just a
Yeah.
different way of seeing it that we're gonna keep delaying radical
Yeah.
transformation. Right.
And we'll come back to the same problem.
Exactly.
Problem.
So I have my final question to you before we close. And it's something that it's related, but not so related. But I think it's comes more from a space of curiosity, specifically when you mentioned that the Philippines were colonized by four different countries, right? Spain, Japan, the UK, the US, in different moments and in different levels, right? But something that I was wondering was, in your opinion, what do you think that are the strongest colonial legacies from these metropolises that continue to shape our relations in the Philippine society until today?
Tough question. Well, one is the obvious answer. The biggest legacy is our backwards capitalist economy, the way it's run, our political class, our whole political structure is actually based on the American uh, with- system. Like
Mm,
we have a Senate, we have the whole bicameral thing, and even like the aspirations of many Filipinos is to it's like we're one of it's like we're one of the countries or one of the people who are still who buy into the American dream even though we're not getting into America. Or like like I think that's one big legacy, the whole mindset of how to live a good life or how to live. It's really based on being consumerist, having a car, like right, and a house, very American dream like, and having a good job. Sorry, having but another thing is our obsession with this is a more cultural thing. Our obsession with how do you say it in English? Patron.
Boss.
Our our patron client networks that we're so dependent on like uh big figures with social and economic and cultural capital.
Mm.
Uh, that's our political culture. Basically, we have like these networks of and relationships of patron and client. I think that's a big vestige of Spanish colonialism and American colonialism.
Mhm.
Uh, that- and that's why a lot. It's been so like because of that vestige, a lot of Filipinos they tend not to believe in collective action because they'd rather believe in uh they'd rather rely on their patron,
I see.
whether it's a local official or their boss. So that's one hindrance and I think one of the biggest legacies of colonialism is the fact that the another aspect of our underdeveloped economy. I think one of the biggest legacies is the fact that our biggest export as a country is labor. Going back to that American dream, Filipinos want to get out of this country. They want to work someplace else because there's higher wages, better government, there's there. I think that's the biggest legacy of one of the biggest legacies of colonialism, both politically, economically, or structurally and culturally. Because structurally, they're compelled to go to other countries, to work in other countries, in the US, in China, anywhere in this world, there's a Filipino working as a domestic servant, as a driver, as a seaman,
Mhm.
as a janitor. I don't know about Brazil, but in a lot of countries that I've had the privilege to visit, I could always see a in London. There are lots of there's a
Yeah.
Filipino store, right? And so economically they're compelled to do this because to provide for their families because the wage here it's really tough to get a good job here that can sustain like a family of 5 or 6. Second, it like people really have aspirations of leaving the country because they think this country is hopeless, right?
Mm.
Because uh they can they can just work somewhere else, right? And try to use that as a stepping stone to migrate completely their whole family. And
Right.
this desire to leave and this desire to work somewhere else because where you're from is shitty. I think that's a colonial legacy because they they impose the perspective that their place is better, right? And we're inferior and we need to be more like them. And they've also fettered our economies and our societies such that we'll never be able to compete with them in terms of the structure, political and economic structures they left
Mm.
behind. So yeah, I guess
Um, no, that makes perfect sense. Thank you so much, Chadley. I'm super impressed with the whole work that you're doing, like a very critical perspective that it's so needed. Like we really need to have this strong, like, and I don't know, it brings a lot of hope and inspiration when it comes to all the paths that you're taking to mobilize labor unions to get together the labor issue with the climate issue, because they are not apart. They should be treated like hand in hand. But most importantly, to bring a different sense of what society we are walking towards, right? To an equitable and just transition, we need to know where we're going.
In summary, today's conversation highlighted the critical links between climate change and labor issues, emphasizing that the most vulnerable groups are the least responsible yet the most affected. We've learned from Chadli about the false solutions and corporate-led transitions that burden small operators and workers in the Philippines, especially in the transport sector. At the DCC, we believe that addressing climate change requires acknowledging and tackling deep-rooted systemic issues stemming from colonial practices of exploitation and capitalist accumulation. So the key takeaway from this episode is the importance of a truly equitable and just transition that addresses the multiple aspects of the crisis that we live in, and one that doesn't leave workers or anyone behind. We call on you to support these movements, follow their work demanding climate justice in different countries of the global south, and addressing the root causes of inequality and exploitation. Follow us on social media and visit our website for more updates and insights. Thank you for watching and see you next time.